Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Johanne Whitmore. I'm senior researcher at the Chair in Energy Sector Management of HEC Montréal, which is one of Canada's biggest business school, although we're French. Today's webinar is basically going to be looking at the crossroad between energy demand and the development of AI. As many of us know, AI promises to bring a lot of innovation, especially when we think about medicine, grid optimization for electricity, businesses, and research. But there's also another reality that its rapid growth depends on energy-intensive infrastructure that can increase environmental and social pressure, especially at local level. Personally, the reason why I wanted to do that is that this webinar is that the industry's motto is move fast and break things. And so this raised a question for me, what are we exactly breaking and what does that imply for the energy sector, the environment and society, and what are the most responsible way to move about it? In Quebec, there's a lot of interest, like many other regions, to host some of these data centers and computing centers. Globally, some of the early estimates showed that between now and 2030, data centers alone could have consume about 280 megawatts, which is about 6 times Quebec's current clean energy capacity, but that could change, and we'll have Tom to talk to us about that. Fortunately, there's lots of efficiency gains that can help. So if we look at the energy required for each query, or reusing some of the heat from the data center, but the escalating demand could also off-gain some of that. So it's difficult to understand how it's moving forward. And increasingly, what we see in the media is the risk of intensifying inequality through rising energy costs, grid strains, and competition of access to resources for the energy transition, because a lot of other existing needs in industry, transportation, and building also require lots of electricity if we want to avoid the climate crisis. So hopefully this webinar can start putting a little bit of light on that. Just already to start, we're not going to be looking at other critical issue of AI. So if you look at water usage, other resource, critical mineral usage, which are all very important, job losses, data sovereignty, other democratic or ethical issues, there's lots of other researchers doing that. So I invite you to also consider that, like the Mila Group, which is an institute in Quebec looking specifically of how to develop responsibly AI. But for this, we're really going to be looking at the energy side. So today's speaker, we have 4, 2 which are from the US, so we'll bring more perspective from the American side, and then 2 from Canada. So our first speaker is Tom Wilson, who is the Principal Technical Executive at the Electric Power Research Institute. He specializes in energy system modeling, and he served as Assistant Director for Electricity at the White House Office of Science and Technology. Since 2023, his work has been focusing on the powering data centers. So he will provide insights on projections for energy demand. Then we have Charles Hua, who is the founder and executive director of Powerlines, which is a nonprofit organization seeking to modernize the utility regulatory system to lower utility bills and to grow the economy. Previously, Charles has served as a senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Energy and also was a researcher at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. For the 2 last panelists, it's going to be Caroline Dewitt, which is a senior director of business development and performance at Hydro-Québec, which is our province's public utility and one of the biggest electricity producer in North America. She leads in energy transition efforts for industrial clients, including data center. And then we have Kate Harland, which is a research lead for clean growth at the Canadian Climate Institute, which is an independent research institute focusing on policy and climate and energy. And so she brings extensive expertise in those fields, especially for responsible innovation. And she's worked with multiple governments across jurisdiction on these issues. So, Tom, before we start, just everyone, if you have questions, I invite you to write them. There's a Q&R button Q&A, sorry, R is in French. So a Q&A button on the bottom, and you can write it up. And at the end, for the time that we have, I will read out the question. If you have a specific question for a specific panelist, just say it immediately, and then we can orient it. And then for the PowerPoints that will be shown, I will be able to send it to everyone afterwards. So you don't have to worry about that or send me emails to ask me. So Tom, you can share your screen, and everyone has 15 minutes to do their presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Joanne. And I really appreciate people doing this in English. My French is abysmal. I was in Paris last week, and I keep getting reminded how bad it is. Let me get my presentation going here. And presentation mode. Okay, I'm Tom Wilson from Electric Power Research Institute, known as EPRI. For those who are not familiar with EPRI, we're have members in 45 countries. We do research broadly about the electric industry and have been around since 1972. So we have a very long history of doing this. I'm going to give a very quick intro to a broad array of issues associated with power for data centers. And so I'll start out with 4 resources I'm drawing from. All of these are public. If you'd like to get more information, they'll be in the slide deck that Joanne provides. The first one is Powering Intelligence. That's the one that's been most widely read. Came out in May of last year. I'll show you a slide from that and talk about how we're updating that. It's making projections of what power demand in the US would be in the future from data centers. The second is talking a little bit about utility experience, what kind of requests your utility is receiving, what size of request, and so on for connection of data centers. The third takes a different look at, once we have this demand, how might it be powered? And so that will be something I'll have a slide on, even though it's a much longer report. And finally, I'll draw a little bit from one of our most recent reports, which is on why are these data centers getting so big? And that's for training of AI. So this is the slide that most people will see from the May 2024 report. It basically said, there's a lot of uncertainty about where data center growth in power consumption might go. The number that was quoted many thousands of times in the press was that EPRI said there could be growth up to 9.1% of electricity consumption by 2030, and that's in the US. There are a lot of challenges for doing this kind of work. Number one challenge is that data centers don't report their electricity consumption, and they don't let the utilities that provide the power to them report it either. In general, they don't report their operational data. They don't tell us load shapes. They don't tell us many things about what's going on inside their data centers. And so even projections or even estimates of the past and the current power consumption are very uncertain. Looking forward, there are fundamental uncertainties about the demand for AI, what types of AI, whether we're going to get into agentic demands, whether we're going to have physical AI demands as robots and other things, and self-driving cars and other things take off. And so there's just fundamental uncertainty about where this is headed. So the projections we have only go through about 2030. We do some modeling that goes to 2050, but it's very uncertain after that point. The scenarios we had last year were basically 5, 10, and 15% annual growth in data center demand in the US. The 15% is now our mid-range. The low scenario is about 10%, as will come out with revisions next month, I believe, is essentially saying what happens if all the projects that are under construction or very far along in development actually come online by 2030. So it's not really, these are not equally probable scenarios going forward. The low scenario is sort of a base for what might happen. In our new report, we'll include crypto. A couple of reasons for that. One is about 7 or 8 gigawatts of demand in the US, peak demand. The other key issue is that a lot of the crypto companies are considering shifting to AI and using that capacity for AI applications. So it's really important both in terms of moving quickly towards AI and satisfying demand for AI as well as for its own demand. We will base state level estimates on construction and plans. I'll show you a slide on that in a second. And we will also include estimates for global markets. So lots of updates coming soon. Okay. Next slide is preliminary. This is not a projection of what might happen in states. This is simply looking at all the data we could find out there, both public and private, of IT capacity that's operating, under construction, and planned. And in planned, we have sort of two categories, one that's pretty far along and another that is early in the planning process. What you can see from this is there's a lot of construction plan underway in Virginia, Texas. There's a lot more that's far along in Virginia for additional capacity. There's some in planning. And then there are a number of states where there's almost no operating capacity today, but there are large plans for the future, in some cases construction underway. So it's a very disparate picture across the US of where this construction is happening. Again, these are not projections because you look at these plans and then you have to figure out what might actually come online by 2030 or a little bit later. Similar picture globally. This is looking at the, in purple, it's the existing capacity. You know, London, Dublin, Tokyo, Frankfurt were the big players in the past. Then looking at what is under construction in yellow and what is planned in blue. This was basically a snapshot around August of this year of what we could find in the public domain on these plans. But you see a lot of areas that are getting into this, this business of AI data centers and just cloud in general. A key thing that is driving the challenges for powering these data centers is the size. And this is a graph. We did a survey last year. I think the survey was conducted through July of last year, 2024, asking utilities, both in North America and Europe, what are you seeing in terms of your existing, what do you have in terms of existing data centers operating in your systems, which is the light pink? And what is the size of data center requests that you're getting now? And this is not the number of data center requests, but just the size. The key thing to note that here is that no one had a data center larger than 500 megawatts operating from the 26 responding utility or 24 responding utilities to this question. But you know, 3/4 of them had requests for up to 500 megawatts. 60% had requests between 500 megawatts and a gigawatt, and almost half of them had requests for data centers bigger than a gigawatt. So the challenge is not just the total power demand, which is a challenge in of itself, but also where the power demand is and how concentrated it is. Why are these data centers getting larger? Well, you can't ignore the underlying trend. The data centers in general for cloud were getting much larger to begin with. In fact, we're close to clusters within a 5 to 10 mile radius of data centers that are around a gigawatt already, just for doing traditional cloud activities. But one of the drivers is the AI training data centers. These are the ones where people say, I need a 5 gigawatt data center or a bigger data center. This is looking at the trend line since 2018, some work that we did with Epic AI that says how big are the leading models and how has their power usage gone up over time. And you basically see the power usage going up at over 2x, 2x per year, 2.2x. We then tried to understand what was driving that trend. A couple of things were how many computations they were making, how much more efficient was the hardware getting over time, and how is the duration of the training expanding. And so the number of computations was going up over 4x a year, almost five times a year in terms of how much they took to train the model. But on the other hand, they were expanding from about 10 days on the left-hand side for training a model to 6 months in some cases on the right-hand side as you move over time. So that would reduce the power usage, so it's not growing at 4 or 5x a year. Also, the efficiency of the hardware improved 26 to 40% a year over that period, depending on what data source you want to believe. So we have a whole paper that gets into these trends, but basically it says these data centers are getting larger, or the training centers are getting larger, and actually they're getting better results as they get larger. For those who have an eagle eye, this is on an exponential scale, so it's a nice linear curve here, but that means it's going straight up through the roof. I'll shift gears quickly to talk about how data centers might be provided power. We had a reference case. We're looking here at the year 2035 US, looking at a sort of moderate data center demand. And the reference case basically assumes that you have a least cost solution. You don't have any constraints on what data centers have committed to doing in terms of climate goals. And also you don't have flexibility in how they operate. So on the left, you get a lot of gas, basically a lot of gas and solar. If, on the other hand, in the middle, you have data centers committing to a hourly matching of carbon-free energy with their demand, which some of the larger ones have committed to, then you have a different mix. You have a lot less gas, you have a lot more storage, and you start to see wind and additional solar come into the picture. A third scenario and also you see a little bit of gray down there, that's actually new nuclear, which is consistent with some of the data centers' commitments towards new nuclear in the medium to long term. On the other hand, if we look at data centers and say, what if they could be flexible, where they're not demanding power at the system peak or when the system is under stress? And we put some hypothetical scenarios in that flexibility in here, and you get still a third mix of power supply options that would supply that power. It has more gas, but without a 24/7 carbon-free energy commitment, but it has a lot more solar and wind. So the answer to how these things might be powered depends somewhat on the commitments of the data centers, and also whether we're able to get them to be flexible. And I'll talk a bit more about that. EPRI initiated a project in late October of last year called DC Flex. And it's not direct current flexibility, but it's data center flexibility to optimize data center operation. The key thing that you've heard from the Duke Nicholas studies and for other studies is that if you're able to be flexible when the grid is under stress, probably for a very limited number of hours a year, then you could start to take advantage of existing capacity of the grid and of generation, and be able to connect without building out the grid as much, be able to connect faster, be able to keep lower costs overall for everyone. We have a data center flexibility initiative that it's over 65 funding members right now. The 4 tracks, flexible data center design, is really aimed at how you can design a data center to be flexible and demonstrating how it can be flexible. Transformational utility programs is how you can incentivize that flexibility. Grid planning operation, how do you include that in planning for the utility so you don't build capacity and not take advantage of that flexibility. And then also focusing on the supply technologies, including batteries and other storage devices that could be the key for providing the future of the data center power. We have demonstrations going on, more than 10 planned. There are 3 listed here that are public, but there are over 7 or 8 that are underway and will be announced soon. If you'd like to get more, we have a data center flexibility participant panel. Go to dcflex.epri.com and you can find out more information about joining that panel. We have a Nature Energy paper that came out last Friday that documents the Phoenix flexibility results. They were looking at compute flexibility with a number of partners. Here's just a view of the people who are funding the project. Developers, hyperscalers, independent power producers, ISOs, RTOs, various folks who are other stakeholders, technology providers, and lots of utilities of various types. So I guess a couple of concluding thoughts, because I'm looking forward to the discussion with our other panelists and the discussion from your questions. Rapid build out of data centers presents a challenge. but it also presents an opportunity. Um, we have a grid challenge of trying to provide this power, but it could be that if they're flexible and we improve coordination with data centers, that they could be a key grid asset, both in terms of reliability as well as in terms of the, meeting the needs of all consumers. We have an environmental challenge. We see a lot of data centers going to gas power in the short term, but also an accelerant to advance clean power. They're willing to pay more for technologies that are clean, but those technologies have to be available with predictable costs and timelines. We have the affordability challenge that Charles will talk about a bit, but you could also see affordability gains that has both strategic um, system cost and regulatory components about how you allocate costs that are real key. And then we have local opposition versus community asset. So there are a lot of things that are happening here. I really appreciate Joanne's introduction. She did a great job in a very short time. It's really important. We're talking about power today, but to focus on many of the current and potential benefits of AI for energy and AI more generally. And that's why we're building these data centers. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. So Charles, it's if you can share your screen. Charles? Okay, great, thanks.
It
Make sure
just
to
doesn't let me turn
yeah,
on my video, but I think everybody can see this,
yeah,
hopefully.
if you yeah, perfect.
Excellent. Um, well, thanks again for convening us for this really important discussion. Um, my name is Charles Hua. I'm the founder and executive director of Powerlines, which is a US-based national energy consumer advocacy nonprofit focused specifically on this issue of utility bills and how we can unlock economic development opportunities while keeping utility bills affordable. Um, as mentioned up top, I will largely focus this presentation in the US context with the hope that certainly some of these elements are transferable across other geographies. But really, what I'm here to talk about is this issue of utility affordability and how that's growing in terms of salience and substance as a economic and political issue as the issues around rising electricity demand and rising electricity prices continue to pick up steam. So just to show some of the headlines that we've seen over the last 6 months, there's been a huge proliferation of discourse around this issue of utility affordability and how consumers are being impacted and why they're going up. There's a lot of concern, confusion, uncertainty around why exactly utility bills are going up. And the reality is that a lot of it is not due to this newer phenomenon of data centers necessarily. These issues have been a big concern for a while. But in this moment, as the challenges of an aging grid, of extreme weather events, and volatile fuel prices have picked up steam, that's driven up bills and will continue to drive up bills. And in certain markets, including in the US, there are pockets where this issue of rising demand from AI and manufacturing and other sources of electricity will put upward pressure on electricity prices, particularly if there isn't enough supply of infrastructure to meet that demand in some of the regions with restructured electricity markets. Part of what we're seeing is a rapid change in utility rate increase requests that has really picked up over the last couple of years in particular. So if you look at the 2020s, utility rate increase requests have rapidly shot up, but just in this year alone, they have really skyrocketed. In fact, in the first 3 quarters of 2025, utilities requested or received approval for a combined $34 billion, which sets a record for any year, certainly is roughly double what it was last year, even, and is concerning for a lot of folks that are already experiencing high utility bills and will experience even further increases with some of these rate increase requests being approved. Uh, Part of what makes this moment particularly interesting is that it's no longer a issue that is just the challenge of a particular region or state. It's actually a national issue, and it's impacting hundreds of millions of consumers across the country, across different regions, all for slightly different reasons. But the issue of data centers does come up, particularly in the Mid-Atlantic region, which covers major U.S. metro markets like Washington, D.C., New Jersey, Philadelphia, Chicago, and parts of Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania and Maryland. Another reason why this issue of utility affordability has really gained significant salience is that it is now the fastest driver of inflation. If you look at the US Consumer Price Index data, electricity and gas are now the two fastest drivers of inflation, which is a fairly new phenomenon. Energy affordability has always been a salient issue, but largely within that, it's been how much people pay at the pump through oil and gas prices, and less so what they pay through their bills at the end of the month, notably through their utility bills. Earlier this year, we put out a report looking at this issue of utility affordability and how American consumers were experiencing this issue. And we found some pretty both surprising and ultimately not surprising results, which is that people are very concerned and they don't feel like their state government is doing enough to protect their interests when it comes to regulating electric and gas utilities. And what was surprising to us about some of this was that for every single question, the difference between Democrats, Independents, and Republicans was no more than a couple percentage points. There was pretty much unanimous concern across the board of consumers on this issue of utility bills. And that's left ultimately 4 in 5 Americans to feel powerless over these costs. And part of what makes utility bills so frustrating, it's not the biggest expense for most people, but what makes it in particular frustrating is that it changes so much month to month in many regions. There's the unpredictability factor, and people feel like they don't have a choice. And certainly that's the case with the monopoly utility structure and how that impacts folks' ability to choose a different provider or the lack of that choice. That, of course, we are now entering this new era of rising electricity demand that Tom talked about, and this is really the biggest thing on the minds of most utilities and utility regulators is what are we going to do about this issue of rising electricity demand? Do we have enough energy resources on the grid to be able to meet that demand? And these are the decisions that are particularly confronted by these utility regulators called public utilities commissioners in the US. We call them the US Supreme Court Justices of Energy. That's how much power that they have because they oversee how much people pay for their utility bills, what types of investments utilities make, and where energy projects are located. They have a tremendous degree of power in the US context in that they have a legislative function and that they create rules and policies. They have a judicial function in that they oversee contested quasi-judicial proceedings like rate cases or integrated resource plans or fuel dockets and other proceedings where utilities are looking to talk about how they're going to meet rising demand. And then they also serve an executive function in terms of implementing certain programs like low-income energy assistance programs, rebate programs, federal incentives, for instance, like the Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of that was administered through these public utilities commissions. So they have a tremendous degree of authority. And all told, there's about 200 of these regulators across the US that oversee roughly $200 billion a year in utility spending. That's $1 billion a commissioner. So there's a lot of influence that's concentrated in a fairly small body. And that's spread across generation, distribution, and transmission assets. Now, what's actually driving up electric prices? Touched on this a little bit, but a big part of the challenge is that distribution is now making up an increasingly large share of U.S. utility spending. So in 2023, based on data from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, which has commissioned these really robust comprehensive reports analyzing what's driven up electricity prices. What they have found is that at least up until 2023, 2024, data centers have not been a primary cause of rising bills in the US. And that a large part of it is this aging grid infrastructure, the local poles and wires on the distribution system that are now, at least in 2023, made up nearly half of all utility capital spending. Some of this is certainly in response to aging poles and wires that are reaching the end of their useful life, and some of it is in response to extreme weather events that are taking a greater toll on grid infrastructure, particularly after hurricanes or winter storms or wildfires. And then some of this is perhaps a lot of consumer advocates worry is overspending that is not needed on distribution poles and wires that may not necessarily serve the most cost-effective option for consumers. But there's a mix of those different reasons as to why distribution spending has significantly increased. But what's different now is that generation is likely, actually going back to this previous slide, is likely to take up a growing share, even though it's declined from 2019 to 2023. Now that this load growth era has really picked up, utilities are saying there's a huge need to build a bunch of new power plants and spend more on generation infrastructure to power those data centers. As Tom mentioned, a lot of that proposed generation infrastructure comes in the form of new natural gas plants, which environmental advocates in the US are certainly concerned about from an emissions standpoint, and consumer advocates are concerned about from a cost standpoint, both the fact that it now costs more to build a gas plant upfront due to supply chain issues and turbine shortages, and also the cost of operating that plant due to an increasing volatile global gas market is creating concerns around what that might mean for consumers who ultimately bear 100% of the risk of volatile fuel costs in the US regulatory context in most states. Part of what's happening also is that the grid is really inefficient in most markets in the US. I would be curious what Canada's figures are, but in the US, it's anywhere from about 40 to 55 or so percent in most markets. And what that means is that there's a huge opportunity to unlock more resources out of the existing grid infrastructure that would put downward pressure on electricity prices. In other words, by taking the fixed costs of the system of the grid, spreading it out over a wider base of users, including data centers, that's a way that data centers could actually help bring down electricity costs by increasing the denominator, which is the number of kilowatt hours, and reducing or minimizing the impact of the numerator, which is fixed system costs. And part of the reason why we don't have that, however, is in the US, utility companies are generally speaking investor-owned for-profit entities that have shareholders. And so they earn a financial return on equity for capital investments, but not operational investments, which means that they have a structural incentive to primarily build new infrastructure, and they have a structural disincentive to maximize the efficiency of existing grid infrastructure, which is why, in many cases, the grid is less operationally efficient relative to what it could be. And so that creates this other dynamic, which is, again, there's an opportunity for utilities to actually take advantage of this rising demand to get more out of the existing grid and therefore lower prices. But it's ultimately incumbent on utilities and their regulators to make sure that they're ultimately following through on that effort. And so far, generally what's been happening is utilities are proposing the build out of significant new infrastructure on the generation side and on the transmission side. And there's a lot of uncertainty around how much is truly the most cost effective for consumers. That's led to some flashy new headlines. Electricity is the new price of eggs. Electricity bills are on the ballot. And voters are concerned about this issue. And it's now increasingly becoming a political issue. This was in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, looking at the Georgia Public Service Commission election, which is the election in the US in 10 states. They elect their utility regulators, where for the first time in almost 20 years, an incumbent public service commissioner in Georgia lost election because of this issue of rising utility bills and the issue of data centers. I encourage folks to take a look at that article, which provides a lot more in-depth discussion about what happened, but there were a lot of people that switched party lines. And I think the main takeaway is that this issue is rapidly becoming a political issue, really in the last 3 to 6 months in the US context. And uh, there's a lot of concern and or opportunity, depending on who you're talking to, that this could become a significant issue in the 2026 midterm elections. And that's a pretty new phenomenon that something like electricity has now become something so salient. Just to reinforce that, there were a couple other elections in the US about a month ago, including the New Jersey and the Virginia governor's races, which featured electricity bills as a top or arguably the top issue in some of these races. So again, this is not just an energy issue, it's become a consumer issue, and now suddenly it's become a political issue as well. I'll close by just sharing an anecdote, which is earlier this year, we had a team retreat in New Orleans, Louisiana, one of the most energy-rich places in the country and in one of the wealthiest and most energy-rich countries in the world. And what the Uber driver shared with us is that he had to move out of his childhood home in New Orleans and to a different place because fundamentally he couldn't pay his utility bills. That was the number one reason why he could not stay in his childhood home. And, he had to work extra shifts as an Uber driver. His wife was a school teacher. And it was a pretty staggering story that for an expense that most consider to be a fairly small part of their budget, what he shared with us was that fundamentally the unpredictability of his utility bills, how much it changed month to month, was just too hard to budget for. And during the summer, he didn't even have AC and his bills were too high. And this is the reality for 80 million Americans, about 1 in 3 households in America that struggle to pay their utility bills. So this was an issue, and it's now increasingly becoming a more and more intense and urgent issue. And so that's why suddenly there's now a ton of focus on this topic in the US political scene, and I imagine elsewhere as well. So I will stop there, and happy to answer any further questions during the Q&A, or here's my email if there are any specific questions, happy to chat offline as well. So I will pass
Yeah,
it
thanks,
back.
Charles. That was great. So we'll go to Caroline next for her PowerPoint. If you can also, Caroline, please turn on your camera. Yeah, and share your screen.
Of course. Hi, everyone. Here we go. Okay. So assuming you can see my screen, I'd like to thank the previous panelists. Thank you so much. It's going to be a very interesting conversation because as this slide is showing, I have a strong French accent, but also I'm going to provide a perspective from Quebec here, especially from Hydro-Québec. The state utility, which is very different, I think, from the perspective we've heard so far, that are more perspective from the US. Maybe I'm gonna state the obvious for some of the audience, but Hydro-Québec is an integrated utility, meaning that we are in charge of both production, transmission, and distribution of electricity in Quebec. And our grid is mostly renewable, which I'm gonna touch upon in a few minutes. Maybe I think what makes us a bit unique, and you're gonna be able to see the connection with what I'm about to say about AI energy demand, is our main shareholder. Our shareholder is the government, and hence it's our citizen of Quebec and our customers. And so that means our mission is obviously to provide affordable, reliable, renewable electricity to Quebec, but also to contribute to the economic development and decarbonization of Quebec, which I think again is maybe a difference with our counterparts in the US and maybe in Europe. So let me start with stating the obvious here. But as our colleagues just mentioned, data centers and driven by the AI demand is definitely creating challenges for utilities because it creates additional demand. That's the obvious. But there are two other trends that I think were worth mentioning because I don't think data centers are the main cause of the challenge today. There are other causes. One of them being like an increase in demand over the past, I would say, 5 years from any industrial customers driven by the energy transition, such as battery players, EV manufacturer, and chemical industry. So this increase in demand is definitely coming very strong from data centers, but also from other types of industries. And then also from decarbonization, which is the main trends here you see on the slide. Of course, we've seen a rise in the adoption of net zero targets since the Paris agreement in 2015. Some of those targets have been reduced in the past months due to the geopolitical situation, but we're seeing a lot of electrification technologies that are here to stay. And that includes, for instance, electric vehicles. And so we still expect like a very strong demand from transportation, for instance, as well as other industrial processes that will electrify at a pace that's still very high, given the fact that the technology is quite developed. There is one point I'd like to make about data centers, AI from a utility perspective. That is Hydro-Québec. That may not be the same in the US or in Europe. But because of our economic development mission, we are also looking at AI from a global economic perspective. So of course it increases demand, but it also increases the competitiveness of our industrial customers. So we want to enable that as much as possible by providing megawatt to those data centers that are indirectly supporting the competitiveness of our industrial customers. I'm going to get into that in a few seconds. And of course, the utilities themselves are users of AI. So I wanted to talk here about one example that at Hydro-Québec, one way we use artificial intelligence. I'm going to talk about management vegetation. For some of you who haven't visited Quebec, we are December 10 and we're expecting a huge snowstorm. And that's going to be like this, I think, during the entire summer, meaning that vegetation management is really critical to prevent outages as much as possible. So we need to trim the vegetation in a preventive manner. Sometimes we also have to do it as a corrective measure, but that means that during the summertime, we try to be as efficient as possible, and we have a great AI system that actually takes picture analyzing the types of trees you have on a street and indicates which trees we should trim because of the length of the branches, but also it is able to identify the species. And depending on the species, some of them actually don't support a lot of weight from the snow, and some other are actually more flexible, so it's not so much an issue. And so that enables us to be very selective and more efficient and quicker in the way we manage the vegetation. So we are, as a utility, even a user of AI, and that unlocks a lot of operational efficiency. So I think we need to recognize that. Again, for the participants here who are maybe less familiar with Quebec, we as being one of the greenest grid in the world, and also one of the utility that offers very competitive rates and that are predictable, sorry, unlike what we see in some of the states in the US. That means we receive a lot of demand from potential customers who want to access green and affordable electricity. So you see actually, if you go on our website, any time of the day, you can check what's the mix of the energy production. And as you can see here, 3 days ago, it was 100%. Sometimes it could go to down to 99%. So it remains a very green grid. And on the right-hand side here, what you see is like the trends in electricity prices comparing the yellow line of Montreal, Quebec, as compared to other jurisdictions in Canada and outside of Canada. As you can see, it's very so it of course increases because we need to finance the development of our infrastructure, but it's not as high as it could be in other jurisdiction. So it's also predictable rates in some ways. Now, so that's the historical perspective. So looking forward now, some of you may be familiar with our action plan for the next 10 years. It's called the Plan d'Action 2035 in French. So already in that action plan, we were planning massive investment up to $200 billion over the next 10 years to do two things. So obviously to strengthen our current existing grid, but also adding more than 10,000 megawatts of capacity, which is actually what we've built over the past 40 years, and we're aiming to do that over the next 10 years. So a very ambitious plan, because we're expecting a lot of demand for economic development, but also for decarbonization. And actually on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see how we expect the megawatt or the terawatt hours to be distributed between different sectors. So that includes transportation with the electrification of vehicle, as well as industrial processes that are on the way of decarbonization, and then some of it also contributing to the economic development of Quebec. So that's the plan for the next 10 years, and so that's why we're also able to accommodate some demand from data centers, because we're able to predict some of that growth. And actually, very recently, we even revised the amount of energy for data centers up as compared to last year, because we can see that increasing trends. That doesn't mean we say yes to all the demand from data centers, because we want to be selective in the types of data centers that can support our economic development vision for Quebec. And actually, on the next slide, you can see the increasing energy consumption trend that we predict for data centers from today up until 2035. It keeps growing, and we can see that also historically with the data centers we have in Quebec. Currently, we have approximately 80 data centers. Just so that I can preempt any question. There are different ways you can count data centers. So sometimes it can be one single company, but with several data centers. That's the number I'm actually referring to. So it's not the numbers of companies owning data centers in Quebec, but really all the data center sites. One particularity, when we look at it from a utility perspective, a data centers has a very specific energy consumption profile, in the sense that the data centers can somehow predict the amount of energy they need over the next 5-6 years, because they sell in advance the hosting capacity to their customers. But that means that for a few years, even though you know that data centers need 100 megawatts, maybe the first 10 years, they are never going to reach that capacity up until the 10th year, meaning that you're kind of reserving capacity for those players, which is very different from other industrial players who are most of the time maximizing the consumption of the full capacity from the first, second, third year maximum, not over a 10-year horizon. And so in Quebec, to recognize that privilege, I would say, to get energy capacity reserved. We have introduced or the Energy Board of Quebec has asked us to apply a penalty for unused capacity, which we are enforcing to limit as much as possible the lost economic opportunity cost. And that brings me actually to the next page here. Some of my previous colleagues have actually mentioned it before, but you have different types of data centers, and that's the way. It's a very simplified view, but that's a way for us to distinguish between storage data centers, edge, and large-scale hyperscalers data centers, because each of them have a different economic impact, either directly or indirectly. As I was mentioning in my introduction, large scale or hyperscalers typically enable indirectly more productivity, more competitiveness for customers. So that's the way we see it from an economic impact. We just don't look at only the direct impact of data centers in Quebec, but we're looking also at it from the perspective of the entire Quebec economy. Right now in Quebec, we have a lot of storage data centers, some edge as well, but very few large-scale data centers. So we will be looking forward opportunities to increase that type of data centers, because we think it's actually critical to unlock some of the economic impact. And maybe to be even more specific about how the way we're thinking about it and allocating megawatt to data centers. For some of you based in Quebec, maybe you're familiar with this process. But in Quebec, when you are requesting more than 5 megawatt of power, you go through a process that is jointly managed and governed by the Ministry of Energy and Economic Development and Hydro-Québec. And so we assess each demand based on the strategic interest, so the actual contribution to the economy, and also to the decarbonization goal of Quebec, as well as the project maturity. And then we make a joint decision, and finally it is the Minister of Economic Development and Energy that makes that delivers the authorization for consuming more than 5 megawatts. So it's a very thorough evaluation process. If you want to ask for power, there is a form you need to fill that asks about information about your project, so that we are able to make that assessment. I just wanted to give you a few examples of questions we are asking ourselves when we assess specifically a data centers or AI related project. We're looking at whether it has secured strategic supplies, if it aligns with a Canadian digital security initiative, if it collaborates with academic research centers in Quebec or in Canada, if it contributes also to industrial clusters in Quebec. And of course, we're also looking at the impact on the regional development in terms of creation of regional job, for instance. So if I conclude here, I would say there are a few opportunities for collaboration here between utilities and data centers. And again, I'm sharing here the perspective of Hydro-Québec, not the perspective of all the utilities in the world. But for us, it's very important to encourage a variety of usages. So I was mentioning the different types of data centers. We want to encourage that variety and to enable direct and indirect economic growth. When we assess projects, we also have very high standard when it comes to energy efficiency and peak demand management. to reflect the value of the renewable and affordable electricity that we provide to our customers. It's not something we only ask to data centers. It's something we ask all our industrial customers and even residential customers. As I was saying, it's very cold in Quebec, so when it comes to winter days, having different means to manage the peak is very important to us. So any innovative ways from data centers players that could help us manage the demand and those peaks is very valuable. And finally, demand planning, very important as well. As I was saying, data centers very different from other types of customers in their demand and the way it grows over years. So the more predictability we have over the upcoming demand, the easier it is for us to secure the production and make sure that we also manage the impact on the rest of our infrastructure deployment and customer base. So I'm gonna stop here and hand over, I think, to Kate.
Yes. Kate, if you can share your presentation. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you, Caroline. Yes, and thank you also to Tom and Charles. You've all touched on some things which I will also touch on today. Hopefully you can see my screen. So I'm from the Canadian Climate Institute, so it makes sense that I'm going to zoom out and talk a little bit about this policy in a Canadian context. But our role at the Institute is really to advise federal and provincial governments across Canada on climate policy. So you'll see a bit of that lens through my presentation today. And I'm going to speak to you about the Canadian AI ambition and the policy problem that surrounds that. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the emissions and electricity rate issues, but from a Canadian perspective. And then I'm going to bring in some ideas about how we could integrate AI in Canada in a strategic way so that we can capture some of these economic benefits, for example, those that Caroline was just talking about, and security benefits, but also consider our climate targets and our electricity rates. So why is there a problem? As I start back with the basics, why is there a problem here at all? Why is it just not a private deal between AI firms and electricity generators? And I think here we're really up to absent intervention. The private market is unlikely to deliver the AI infrastructure in a way that delivers all of the goals that we want to line up neatly within Canada. So these goals, whether they're national security and data sovereignty and where that data is stored and who controls it, they are questions about investment and economic growth, but not at the expense, for example, of other sectors which are also competing for some of the same electricity supply. They're questions around our emissions reductions, our climate commitments, and of course those bill impacts and electricity rate questions, some of which Charles touched on in his presentation. And we have an additional complication that some of these goals and benefits have a very much of a national lens, a national security question, and national climate ambitions. But while others deliver some very localized benefits to jobs, to the tax base, or to provincial rate impacts on electricity rates, for example. And those electricity systems that are supplying the electricity for AI, they're all governed provincially, heavily regulated, and they, for the most part, and they all have their own mandates to deliver to their own ratepayers reliability and affordability and security. So we're trying to balance all of these pieces and fit them together. What is clear is that AI has the full attention of the federal government. So we have a first ever Minister for AI and Digital Innovation in Canada. We have money in the budget and we have a national strategy. And that strategy does mention energy. It mentions energy, but as a competitive advantage for Canada. What it doesn't do yet is really quantify what is needed to fill in terms of energy, what is needed if we're going to bring up the capacity in Canada, this limited availability of domestic capacity on AI compute that Caroline referred to a little bit. What's the energy gap? Like, how much power would it take to fill that gap, and kind of really put a number to that? The federal government has talked a bit about energy and AI in terms of efficiency, and there's a new G7 working group, for example, on this topic, but there's just a lack of detail here. But at the same time, we do see development across the country. sorry, skipping one, on policy. So provinces are already making choices about AI and data centers through their electricity policy. And so what I've done on this slide is really color code some of the provinces in yellow and green. The yellow ones have more of tighter restrictions effectively on data centers, or a selection process like the one that Caroline described in Quebec, to really start to allocate power between loads. Whereas the green provinces have more of an open, traditional first come, first served approach to power. Alberta here I've colored green, but they do have some new limits, for example, just because of the flood of interest that they've seen to their queues there. And I want to acknowledge that most of these changes are really recent. So a lot of these policy changes have occurred since 2024 and they're still evolving. But the types of things we see are capping of new data center load applications for grid connections. BC has one recently, for example, so 300 megawatts for AI and 100 for data centers are the numbers there. We see provinces moving away from this pure first come, first serve towards allocation based on criteria like Quebec's for all load, or criteria specific to data and AI. We also see provinces talking about considering higher rates for data centers themselves. Although this particular idea does raise some questions about fairness and some of the regulatory standards that exist already. But what we're really talking about here is allocating a limited amount of supply of power between users and making explicit decisions at the provincial level about where AI sits in that priority queue. And that doesn't always line with where it sits in the priority queue nationally. And if provinces make conservative assumptions about demand and future load in their planning, this trend of rationing scarce capacity, of making choices, of turning down some projects will likely accelerate. So this is another trend that we need to be aware of in the background. And why don't provinces just build more to supply and meet this AI demand? I'd start with in the hydro-dominant provinces, one of the biggest reasons, or one of the central reasons, is rate pressure. Right? It's extremely hard to beat a paid-off hydro dam on cost, even if you're adding relatively cheap renewables and the wire upgrades they require. That will still have some impact on rates. And these rates are low, but they're very politically sensitive. So if rates increase, that can undermine some of the political support. It can raise equity concerns, and it can delay some of the electrification and resulting emission savings that we're actually looking for as a result of those rising electricity prices. So this rates issue becomes core in a hydro-dominant world. In provinces without this legacy hydro infrastructure, the equations are different, and sometimes there's spare supply like there is in Alberta right now. So the rate story is different, but you see a different risk. Here you see a risk of direct emissions, depending on how this demand is powered. And electricity really has been a success story in Canada. This is where we've seen some of the biggest emissions reductions in Canada since 2005. I've included a chart here from our 440 team, which just shows that. And what we can really see here with this reduction in both in megatons and in percentage change, you can really see electricity stands out. And part of that is especially true in places like Alberta, which have moved off coal much faster than expected. But if we say, let's take all the data centers that are currently in Alberta's queue and power them mainly with new gas generation, this infrastructure that runs almost 760 hours a year, the province's electricity sector emissions could roughly double, going back and erasing much of that gain that we've seen from the coal phase out in recent years. And backtracking in that clean electricity is also dangerous because electricity is seen as this vehicle. It's supposed to be the enabler of decarbonisation of other sectors on this list, from transportation to buildings to industry. So how we power a new load really matters. And that's going to bring me neatly to the recent provincial MOU federal MOU between the Alberta government and Canada, and its mention of data centres. And it's really important here because of the explicit link between supporting growth in the electricity grid and AI computing, but also because the MOU itself is creating some room for Alberta to sidestep some of the clean electricity regulations, and therefore to potentially power some of this computing with new gas generation. You've seen that in some of the recent media announcements from some of the potential generators. And that has the potential emissions consequences that I kind of raised on the last slide. Alberta does have a tier industrial carbon pricing scheme, which in the past has supported clean electricity and has actually helped with this transition off coal. But right now, there's sort of problems with excess credits and stringency and the kind of economics there. So it's not equivalent to the CER, the Canada electricity regulations. And even, there's even been some more recent developments since that MOU was announced, which can make this path harder and continue to creak open that door towards new gas generation. It also adds policy uncertainty into this landscape, the MOU. It blurs this long-term expectations that there were around powering new load with clean supply, and it makes it harder to commit capital to clean electricity. That's all of these impacts. So just a little bit of a recap so far. What we see is this federal ambition for AI and clean power, but we don't yet see full quantification of the electricity needs. What we do see, the link the two, what we do see is a provincial gating of some of AI demand. So we see competition for limited grid capacity, and we see some issues around rates. We see some issues around the risk of undoing climate progress with regards to emissions. But what we really want when we think about AI and investments is to land those investments in locations and at a scale which delivers on their economic security and value for Canada. I think that speaks very well to what Caroline was just talking about. Yes, we want to make sure those facilities have clean power, and yes, we want to minimize the impacts of those facilities on the customers' bills and reliability. But it does mean that we're almost certainly not looking at situating all the facilities in one province, and we probably have to solve these problems of emissions, these problems of rates, depending on where those locations are most strategic. Unfortunately, what we do have is some opportunities. So, fortunately, we do have an alternative to gas-fired build-out, and renewables and storage are more cost competitive than ever. So, on a lifetime cost basis, renewables can compete well with new gas generation, even with some battery storage attached, but they do require some balancing with that. And here, Canada has a really important asset. We have these highly flexible hydro systems like the one in Quebec or BC or in Manitoba, for example. And these are ideal for balancing variable renewables, even seasonally with the big hydro dams. So if we can better connect them to the neighboring grids, which are often the ones which have the renewables, there's a map on the right side of this chart, which shows that it's from our older work from the Big Switch, but it really shows that provinces with hydro are often neighbours to provinces which have high wind and solar potential, marked in yellow and orange. If we can better connect these different grid systems, we can deliver some more competitive electricity systems. And what we also see, which is some of our forthcoming modelling work at the Institute, is an economic case for storage and interties that gets much stronger the more and more industrial load growth we see for things like data centres and other uses. We also have opportunity from flexibility of the demand itself. So I think I'll thank our previous speakers here from really leaning into this. But if we have flexible demand from AI, or can use AI as an enabler for other sectors in terms of flexibility, we can help to handle that cost issue, the issue of rising rates. And this can mean providing incentives or priority to facilities that agree to turn down their load, say by 30% during those top 50 or to 100 hours of a year. It can mean even more advanced technology. So here I've just included an example paper, which is really about data centers adjusting some workloads in response to grid conditions. And of course, AI and digital tools have the potential also to unlock some flexibility in other sectors. So that could be in buildings with like smart energy management systems. It could be with managed EV charging, and it could be with industrial processes that can shift over time. And we shouldn't forget as well this energy efficiency element and some of the potential here for waste heat recovery. What we've heard as well from Caroline is that a lot of Canada's electricity systems are really winter peaking. So they have this peak demand in winter that really drives the cost of the system. So reusing data center waste heat, for example, through district heating systems, any offset that you can do to that peak heating load really helps systems like ours and helps reduce the scale of infrastructure build out required in the coming decades. So if we add this all together, what does it mean? What can governments do next? What are the kind of takeaways that I would give to you? I'd say, first of all, make the math visible. Publish the federal government can move to publish credible estimates of electricity needs associated with the AI demand and the AI ambition and other strategic sectors, so that we can have this grounded conversation on future electricity needs for these sectors across Canada. This will inform a discussion about where it makes most sense to support and make space for AI facilities strategically, both from this economic and security lens, but also from an infrastructure perspective. And it may mean solving those different challenges which emerge in different ways across different provinces and different systems with different energy mixes. We also have potential opportunity. So with rate for solutions, so to help with rate pressure, we already have some national fiscal tools which work well, like the Canada Infrastructure Bank, the Clean Electricity Investment Tax Credits, and these could help support financing grid upgrades and new clean electricity generation to power the strategic infrastructure. And what they do, these blended finance tools, is they move some of the costs which would otherwise be falling on provincial ratepayers into the more of the national tax base, and where there's that echoes really when there's a clear national benefit for doing so. It makes sense, so it's justifiable to kind of use some of these mechanisms. The Ottawa can also look to strengthen the industrial carbon pricing signals. We can look to maintain the integrity of the clean electricity regulations. But there's also been announcements like the one I mentioned in that MOU, which talk about structured support for AI and AI projects in a framework. And in that framework, they can favor projects that pair AI growth with new clean supply and storage and flexibility. And finally, I think my other speakers have also really lent in here as well. Flexibility is so important. Rates and reliability and emissions can all improve if electricity systems are supported by a flexible backbone. So that means interties between provinces and more storage, and flexible demand as well. So that means more incentives and more, whether that's pushing something up the queue because it can offer some flexibility, or whether that's incentive in terms of rates, for example. Delivering that will really help with the overall system costs. And if we can have a strategy that leans into some of these actions, I think we can reduce some of the trade-offs that we've discussed today. Some of those trade-offs, those policy issues that we discussed at the very beginning, and better respond to the energy needs of AI and competing sectors as they emerge over time. So I think I'm going to pass back to Johanne for some Q&A. I've got my details on the next slide. So if you have any questions, my email's on this slide as well. So happy to answer questions, but also to follow up via email offline.
Wonderful, thank you. So maybe all speakers can come back with their cameras, and we have about 10, 12 minutes for questions. There's about 8 right now. I have just a quick question. I will take the fact that I'm organized the event to ask one. Maybe I can fit with you, Kate, and Tom, perhaps, and even maybe Caroline, because like I also believe there's a lot of opportunities to make AI more efficient, especially like you said, using the waste energy. We're already doing some of that in Quebec, but how do we minimize effect? Because often we talk about efficiency, but that gain can also increase opportunities for consuming or using more resources. And so there's this relative sort of improvement you can do, but then there's the overall, if we want the performance from an environmental or overall energy performance, that needs to be modulating that. So is that taken account in the modeling, or what would be some recommendation on that end? If somebody wants to speak about it. Tom?
I guess I could start while the people who know more about it think about it. The waste heat was not included in any of the calculations that we did or projections. In the US, there's not a whole lot of potential for using the waste heat for district heating and things like that, except in a couple of our cities, but we're not building large data centers in our cities. It is a requirement in Germany to recover waste heat for data centers. And so in regions of the world where you do have the infrastructure to use that sort of low temperature waste heat in terms of an industrial setting, that is happening. And
did Caroline or Kate did want to add something? Or?
Well, maybe if I can add, when we look at a project, we of course also, as I was mentioning, we held it to very high standards when it comes to energy efficiency. So any project that can recover the heat is gonna get extra points, if I can say so. What I can observe, though, based on different projects we've been assessing, is that the efficiency of the full process depends on how the waste heat is recovered and who is recovering it, how far is the users of the waste based, because sometimes the costs are so high that it would be unfair to ask the project promoter to actually finance that.
Okay. Okay, you want to ask quickly?
Yeah, I think it's unfair to make it a precondition for the reasons which Caroline has asked, but I think the incentivizing this and opening the opportunities so where there is a case or to connect, and particularly if there's an existing district heating system, we have them in Vancouver, for example, and other places, as well, then there's opportunity there. So it's kind of keeping that door open to those options where there's a system that can be plugged into, or there's another connection that can be made.
Okay, so the first question, Tom,
Johanne,
I think.
going to add from a technological standpoint, the way we're cooling data centers, particularly AI data centers, is changing. I mean, the heat density is so intense that you have to go to liquid cooling methods. And when you're dealing with liquids, it's easier to extract the heat from that than it is from air cooling. And so there is potential there, but yeah, it's evolving quickly.
But that raises other issues with the usage of water, so it's kind of a chicken or egg. Anyways, so this the first question was after your presentation, Tom. Somebody asked, have the utilities shared with you how they are managing ratepayer impacts from these large power customers?
Yeah, so they're sharing publicly, and it's public utility commissions are as vocal as utilities. It's sort of the utilities don't do anything without the public utility commissions, as Charles outlined in his presentation. You're seeing, an announcement I think last week in Indiana where they basically have said we're going to cover all the costs of the data center, and make them pay for it, but they're going to be using our transmission line that existed already and had excess capacity on it. So here's how much we're going to give each consumer as a reduction in their rate based on having to pay less for the transmission line because we now have another customer on it. So you have people coming out being that explicit in terms of what the cost sharing is. You see utilities talking about reducing rates that's less explicit also. So yeah.
I think this is another question for you. You had actually quite a few while you were giving your presentation. So somebody asked, since AI data center load profiles can be highly variable and may not be shared with ISOs, how does this limit efforts by ISOs to balance generation and demand, namely via demand response programs?
So I'll use that as an opening to bring up 2 points. One is that and it's pretty widely discussed now, AI training data centers can vary their demand for electricity by 40, 50% on a millisecond level, which is a power quality issue. It's going up and down really, really fast. Typically, data center demands not at the millisecond level, but at the minute level or 10-minute level or hour level are flat or relatively flat. And so they actually help you improve the utilization of the system in some cases because they are relatively flat. All other demands are going up and down all the time. So yeah, in terms of balancing, having flexibility on a sort of 10-minute, hour basis in a data center can really help. In California, we have a problem every day when the sun goes down, when it's high demand. And we have a problem when the sun comes up just because of the ramping of that going on. In other regions, it's wind, and you're blessed by a lot of hydro in Canada. So you have different opportunities as well as challenges there. but the data centers being flexible to some extent could help with that.
There's a question for you, Charles. Somebody asked, is customer rates increase issue not an issue that regulatory tarification principles are badly applied? The customer category that cause costs should pay for these costs and not the other categories for customer. Not sure if that's a clear question because there's a lot of little, but does that make sense for you?
It does. I think
Okay.
this is one of the biggest questions that utility regulators and grid operators are grappling with. And it's not a simple question, which is if demand is rising from a bunch of different sources, but let's even just say even if it was entirely AI, and that requires the utility or grid operator to build new grid infrastructure, new transmission lines, or new power plants. Well, you can make the argument, well, if you didn't need more demand, if there wasn't more demand, then you wouldn't need to build that infrastructure. So then the new demand should pay for all of it. You could also make the argument that, well, that new infrastructure will benefit all existing consumers as well. So shouldn't existing consumers pay for some of it? And that's not a particularly easy question to tackle. And there's some element of subjectivity. And it's the job of the regulator to balance those considerations. So that, as you can imagine, is overwhelming to a lot of regulators, particularly for many who have not seen demand for electricity rise over the last 20, 30 years to a meaningful degree. And so there's different approaches that different states are taking, like creating a new customer class just for data center customers. There's what's called large load tariff design, which is for any type of customer that uses more than a certain amount of electricity, let's say 20 megawatts or 50 megawatts, what's the rate structure that should be applied to them? There's other efforts to try and put kind of upfront, requirements for paying upfront for those customers or minimum contracts so that they have to sign an agreement with the utility company for 10 years or 15 years or 20 years to minimize the risk of stranded assets. There's a lot of different efforts that different jurisdictions are taking, but there isn't one clear emerging solution that's being put forth at scale.
Thanks.
I can add to that as also you have to treat it as a group, right? You can't treat one project and have that one project, for example, pay more very much than some of these constructs that you have, because otherwise you have a fairness question of, well, someone who can pay more just ends up can end up capturing all of that supply, even if they don't bring the benefits that you want for economic benefits or other benefits to the system. So yeah.
So somebody asked, from discussions with utilities, we are hearing that many data centers are queuing in many jurisdictions, waiting to see where they get approved first or for the cheapest. This adds more upcoming projects, i.e. projects is in more than one utility queue. That is really planned, making hard for utilities to have a good understanding of what's coming their way. Do any of the presenters have an idea of the size of this phenomenon? Maybe Tom or Caroline?
Yeah, I mean, the phenomenon is real. If you look at I had that one report, there's a survey of what utilities were getting in terms of requests. There are a huge number of requests in there that are duplicative of another different geographies, but also even worse than that, you have sometimes 3 or 4 developers come in who are trying to sell a data center to a customer and basically racing to develop capacity for the same customer. So the customer only wants one data center, but you have 4 developers trying to develop it for them. And so you're getting those kind of duplications as well. The way that utilities are dealing with it, because this wasn't a problem in the past, this has been a problem since 2023. The way they're dealing with it is trying to screen those applications to see how real they are. Is it a real customer? So, do they have permits? Do they have water? Do they have everything? The other key thing here to note is that if you look at a database, a commercial database of all the projects out there, in the US, about a third of those projects are people who've never built a data center before. And so they're announced publicly, whatnot, and some are very high profile. But it is interesting to see that about a third of the announcements are people who don't have any operating data centers. So it's interesting business right now.
Free for all. Caroline, did you have something you want to add?
Yeah, and maybe just to build on Tom's answer, I'm not surprised by the phenomenon. I don't have the answer about the size of the phenomenon. What I can say though is that it's not data centers are not an exception. Other industrial players looking for large amount of electricity, they are going to bet on different jurisdiction, which is totally understandable when you have a business idea. So the way we manage it is exactly what the principle that Tom you were alluding to, which is to select like projects that are as mature as possible, where we have visibility on the types of permit that they need, and we would like prioritize those that are as close as possible to the date of operation.
Maybe I'll rebound a question on that. Would it be important, Kate, because you were proposing like to have some kind of frame to be able to bring this, to have and to ensure that we don't have like a race to the bottom, because they have the companies have a lot of leverage to say we're going to bring jobs, we're going to bring lots of economic opportunities for your community, but with all the sort of other implications of building out infrastructure, the costs that could incur over time, should there be like a minimal standard of like throughout different jurisdictions to ensure that we don't go just so low that it can become an impact for communities or for regulation, because then we have to erode a regulation in order to try to attract big data centers? Like, is there a limit to what would be the best outcome for everyone?
I think this is why you need some form of national peace, because when you have when one jurisdiction says yes or no, it can push that request to another jurisdiction, and like even within Canada between provinces and the like. So I mean, the queue list issue is real. So Alberta's queue list, for example, is for a data center, the load is the same size as the size of or bigger than the size of their grid in terms of the gigawatts that we're talking about here in their list. But if you then say, oh, well, you have to be completely ready before you join that queue, you kind of move the problem down the chain. You move that problem towards communities who maybe have to provide their approval or towards other approval parts of the process who are dealing with projects which may not really come to fruition, and that causes a problem somewhere else. So having some degree of idea of, no, this is the actual amount of electricity or maximum amount of projects that we need nationally. This is what we need to sort of build out this system. It would make sense to kind of get a grapple with some of this kind of phantom project question, or pushing projects or whether they're real or otherwise from one jurisdiction to the other, onto other parts of the system. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, Carolyn, you will have the last question because it's already 11:29. But the question is the forecast for the average energy demand of data center take also into account potential energy savings that we could have by taking advantage of the heat generated? So whenever that's possible. So I guess you already kind of answered that when we talked about wasted heat, but.
Yeah, exactly. What I would say though is we expect any companies, including data centers, to apply best practices when it comes to energy efficiency and peak demand management. So it's actually an obligation to participate to our peak demand management programs when you're data centers. So for all the traditional, I would say, energy efficiency measure, it's already built in our prediction for sure. When it comes to waste recovery, it's not for the same reason I mentioned before, because it's hard to predict what's going to be the impact on the overall demand for Quebec, because typically the benefiting entity is not going to be the data centers itself, but like a third-party users who is saving energy as a result of using the waste heat. So it's not building our prediction that way.
And just a rebound question from someone else that's related. It says, is allocating megawatts in priority to AI centers has a risk of delaying decarbonization for the economy?
We try to have a balanced approach to economic development and decarbonization. So it should not, I would say.
Oh, okay, on that, I will end. It's 11:31. So thank you so much. I think we need more discussions like this. This is, in my view, was very rich in insights, and hopefully it will stimulate other colleagues in universities to do similar discussions. So the reports will be sent, and if you have further questions, you can contact our panelists directly. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Merci.
Merci.
Merci.